We're so excited to welcome Dr. Paul Wise today. Thank you everyone for being here, and let's get started. First, we'll just do a little overview of the Stanford Healthcare Design Challenge and keep you guys updated about what's been going on. So today is around halfway through our September Learning series, and we will be having a talk with Dr. Paul Wise, who is an incredible pediatrician and lecturer here at Stanford. So just to emphasize kind of like the structure of SHDC being based on the typical hackathon, we wanted to explain that only 7% of projects typically have had any activity 6 months after a hackathon ended. So what makes SHDC different is that we provide students with the follow-up support that they need in order to take their solutions and their ideas and implement them into reality. And so, how we do that is by bridging the ideation to implementation gap with industry engagement and mentorship, which we believe is crucial to ensuring that everyone's innovative ideas have the support they need. So, whether by democratizing knowledge through our open learning series, expanding access through our vast mentor pool, or engaging industry decision makers in our expert judging panel, we provide all of the support that students need to ensure continuity. So winning teams will receive additional support for customer discovery and go-to-market, advisory board composed of C-suite or senior executive level mentors, access to additional perks through our industry partners, and support to make our ideas a reality. So here's our team. We have people from all over the school, from all different backgrounds and in all different disciplines. So you'll see here that we have some undergrad students working and doing Bachelors of Sciences, and we have some JD, MD, MA, and PhD students as well. So we really emphasize here at SHDC having this interdisciplinary team and approach in order to be able to have all of the resources needed to implement solutions. This year, we have a truly global vision. So, expanding from our national competition last year, we are doing an international competition in 2025 that is open to any student at any university anywhere on the planet. So, we're so excited to have everyone today. Here is a little run through of our prompt, in which we're focusing on financially sustainable and scalable healthcare solutions that address the healthcare needs of a population experiencing global transitions. This could specifically be voluntary or involuntary migrants, and it could be within a domestic or an international context. So, for any additional details, requirements for the competition, or the application form, please feel free to check out our website using this QR code. And always feel free to send us an email. Here are the key dates and the timeline for the competition. We've already released our prompt on September 1st, and we are now in our September Learning series, which will end on the 19th. Our applications are due on September 22nd, and we'll have the virtual competition held from October 6th to 17th. This will culminate in an incredible demo day with all of our judges on October 17th, so please join us then. Finally, let's just quickly run through our September programming. Today, it is September 8th, and we're going to be speaking with Dr. Paul Wise, and we have many more exciting talks coming up, so please make sure that you're registered to all of them. So without further ado, let's get started. Thank you so much to everyone for being here. It is my honor to introduce Dr. Paul Wise, a pediatrician whose career reads like a roadmap of humanitarian medicine. From rural Central America to war zones, Dr. Wise has brought care and dignity to children in the most challenging environments. As a Stanford professor and policy advisor, he bridges direct care with systems level reform. Everyone prepare to be moved and challenged by his call to put the world's most vulnerable at the center of innovation. In today's talk, we will explore how humanitarian medicine and policy reform can work hand in hand to protect the health of migrant and displaced children. With decades of experience delivering pediatric care and advising national leaders on healthcare policy, Dr. Paul Wise offers a rare dual lens into both the front lines of care and the corridors of power. Our conversation today will explore how global solidarity, moral clarity, and systems level thinking can inform more humane responses to the health needs of vulnerable populations. Dr. Wise will share hard-won insights on bridging clinical care with advocacy and how innovation must start by centering those too often left at the margins. So, let's get started. I'll hand it over to Dr. Wise right now.
Out. who was pulled out of the rubble of Aleppo, Syria, after his building was bombed by either Syrian or Russian aircraft. This image, some of you may have already seen because it went viral around the world. It's a compelling image, but what is also tragic about it is that this is not unusual. On that same day, 12 other children were pulled out of the rubble of the same building, taken to the emergency area at Aleppo on that day. That the tragedy of Omar Daknish is not only that he had to experience this event, but that it's routine, that it's happening all over the world. And much of what I'm going to be talking about, and particularly the challenges to people like you all, is how best to confront these events. How do we better protect non-combatants in conflict areas? And particularly, how do we render comfort and healthcare that can be life-saving at times to people in need? We think about the impact of conflict on non-combatants, on civilians. You could think of it in sort of two ways. One is the direct effects, and that is basically direct exposure to bombs and bullets. And this is what direct effects look like, where injuries take place, deaths take place because of combat operations that they are not protected from. That was Yemen. This is Mosul in northern Iraq. And the direct effects not only are trauma injuries that can be life-threatening, but also mental health impact of direct exposure to combat operations. This is in Iraq, and the mental health implications, not only for children, but for all who are exposed, can be dramatic and undermine life potential for years to come. This is a child. I was part of a team that evaluated the health response to civilians in the Battle of Mosul in northern Iraq in 2016, 17. And this child basically illustrated to me how dynamic warfare is and how dynamic the threat to non-combatant populations can be. This child, you could see, has an injured foot. He had part of his foot amputated, but doing well. You see he's smiling, but they couldn't send him home, even though he was well enough to be discharged, because he was an orphan. Both his father and mother were ISIS suicide bombers. And it helped to underscore the changing dynamics of warfare, the changing nature of combat and of combatants, and that the challenges to the health community should always be recognized as being as dynamic as the warfare is and increasingly can be. Also have to talk about Gaza. The direct exposure, the direct effects of the war in Gaza have been dramatic, continue to be dramatic. And I, with a colleague, Zulfikar Bhutta, in a Pakistani pediatrician in Toronto, we analyzed the impact of deaths to children in Gaza compared to other recent conflicts. And as you can see, the a number of direct effects, the number of deaths due to combat operations in Gaza and this was based on the end of 2024, so this is already out of date. But it now has become by far the largest number of child deaths due to exposure to combat operations in recent memory. But there are also indirect effects. And the indirect effects are not from direct exposure to bombs and bullets, but by the destruction of the essentials of life, the destruction of food supplies, destruction of transportation, of displacement, the destruction of community protections, of communities that are forced to flee. And the indirect effects almost always are greater than the direct effects. And this was a project we did with colleagues here at Stanford, assessing the impact of the war in Yemen on cholera, the cholera outbreaks and cholera deaths. And what we were particularly focused upon was the destruction of water infrastructure by Saudi bombings in Houthi areas. And this is a desalination plant before, this is a desalination plant after. And what we found by, let me talk here, what we found was that the bombing of water infrastructure was not just collateral damage, but was in fact often just targeted with multiple hits on water infrastructure. And I'm going to show you now pictures of what indirect effects can look like. It can be dramatic, but my assumption is that anybody who's interested in addressing the requirements of protecting civilians in areas of warfare need to understand what indirect effects look like. This is indirect effects in Yemen with significant malnutrition and cholera outbreaks. This is what the indirect effects look like. And what we found is when we plotted using satellite imagery and social media and other reports, is we found that indeed the cholera outbreaks, the cholera deaths were associated with the destruction of water infrastructure, because you basically get cholera from unclean water. And again, the indirect effects are almost always larger than the direct effects. This is Ukraine, where just over the past 48 hours, Russia has attacked urban residential populations with greater bombardments that we've seen so far since the war began in February 2022. The direct effects are real. But we're also very interested in the indirect effects in Ukraine. And I've been part of a network that has been addressing the needs of children with catastrophic disease in Ukraine, particularly children with cancer. Again, the indirect effects of warfare. This is the first week of the war in the bomb shelter of the major children's cancer center in Kyiv, Ukraine. And these were the images that flashed around the world. And the response was actually quite overwhelming and offers to support the evacuation of children in threatened areas to particularly cancer treatment programs throughout Europe, some the United States and Canada, but primarily to European countries, um, began to take shape very quickly. And this is photographs that I took. This is week 3 of the attack on Ukraine. And this is in Poland, in the receiving center, triage center for children who were convoyed on this medical train from Lviv, Ukraine, into Poland, where they were met by, as you can see, Red Cross workers, firefighters, overwhelming Polish support for this train, which had 150 children with cancer, and caretakers, almost always their mothers and other sibs, since men of military age are not allowed to leave Ukraine. And they were taken to the triage center here, which was staffed by Polish nurses, volunteers, pediatric oncologists to stabilize the children, make sure they had a good place to sleep, meals, and social support before they were transported to medical facilities throughout Europe. These are some of the Ukrainian families uh, that were there when I was there. This was week 3 of the war, and I had the privilege of flying back on military aircraft. This group of children who were flown to St. Jude's Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee, one of the premier cancer facilities in the world for children. And St. Jude has supported this network from the very beginning and continues today. Approximately 2,000 children have been evacuated with cancer from Ukraine to facilities throughout Europe since the war began. And it has attracted attention, and the effort over the past year has shifted to supporting the provision of appropriate high quality care for children in Ukraine so they could stay in Ukraine near their own home communities and not require evacuation. Children are still being evacuated. This week, there are going to be 3 kids who are being evacuated, but they tend to be children with advanced types of cancer that require special treatment in facilities outside of Ukraine. A similar network has been set up to address the indirect effects in Gaza. There is famine, starvation, child starvation in Gaza currently. And the effort has also been, from the beginning of the war, to evacuate children with catastrophic disease to facilities, primarily in the Middle East, but increasingly to Europe and other parts of the world who are requiring advanced treatment. Also in Sudan, starvation associated with conflict has been dramatic, and efforts to try to address the requirements of providing nutrition services, health services in these regions, like Sudan, like Gaza, like Ukraine, have been for underway now for some time, but require not only more funding, but also new technical strategies. The reason that I'm talking to you all is because my hope is that you will be able to develop the innovations that are required. This is Gaza and the Rafah Gate, and ambulances awaiting the first set of evacuated children with cancer. There have been almost 200 children with cancer who have been evacuated from Gaza. It's much more difficult to evacuate injured children, children with catastrophic disease out of Gaza. there are a number of roadblocks that Egypt, Israel, now the United States have um, put up to make it more difficult to evacuate children in need of urgent care. Our hope is that um, that progress in ceasefires, but also diplomatic pressure will allow a larger number of people who require health care, certainly children with catastrophic disease, to leave Gaza and find appropriate care in facilities in the region or wherever they're willing to take them. And this too has attracted some attention, although not enough. The last arena of activity that I'm personally involved in is on the U.S. southern border. This is a caravan of migrants, primarily from Central America. This was 2 years ago, uh, walking through Mexico to the southern border. The southern border has always had uh, migrants attempting to cross without documentation, but almost always it was adult Mexican men looking for work. What changed in 2014, 15, 16 was it became families and unaccompanied children. And in 2023, there were 150,000 unaccompanied children who crossed the border and came into U.S. detention, about 500,000 children and families over the same time period. My role has been that I've been working for the U.S. federal court that oversees the treatment of children in U.S. Custody. I'm the juvenile care monitor for the southern border, particularly for the busiest two sectors, the El Paso sector and Rio Grande Valley sector. And I've spent a lot of time over the last 6 years in these detention facilities along the border, addressing the needs of families and children who have come into detention. This is what the largest center in the Rio Grande Valley. These are unaccompanied children. This is a Border Patrol facility who came into detention. You see them, this was when it was fairly crowded. It is not crowded now. In fact, this facility shut down because there weren't sufficient numbers of children coming into detention to warrant such a big facility. This is El Paso, that's the Rio Grande River, with Ciudad Juarez on the other side, and Texas National Guard troops deployed. Increasingly, it has been militarized southern border, and the numbers of migrants coming into detention, particularly families and unaccompanied children, has dropped dramatically. Instead of 10,000 a week, we're talking closer to 300 a week. And when I was there 2 weeks ago in El Paso, in a facility that had in the past housed 5,000 individuals, families, and children, unaccompanied children, there were 13. Five unaccompanied children, and the rest were individuals and families, including adults. So things have changed dramatically on the border, and the effort and concerns have focused to what's called interior enforcement in the United States. That's ICE raids and arrests of undocumented immigrants who are living in the United States. The issue is not so much coming across the border right now, but interior enforcement and the health and well-being of, for me, the children in families and unaccompanied children who are in detention and are likely to be deported. So let me stop there and basically recognize that health workers are always the ultimate inheritors of a failed social order. Sooner or later, a breakdown in the bonds that define collective peace in communities that, in fact, ensure social justice will ultimately find tragic expression in the clinic, on the ward, or in the morgue. And that has always given health workers the opportunity, if not the responsibility, to act as advocates for the protection of non-combatants in complex security environments. But it has also required a search for technical strategies that can overcome the obstacles that conflict generates and ultimately be able to provide the comfort and life-saving care in the face of what has always been the most extreme challenge for health workers, which is the human consequences of war. Well, thank you. I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you so much for sharing, Dr. Wise. We just wanted to open it up first to any panelists. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the chat as we go along, and we'll address them. So for now, we have some questions that we prepared on our end, and we'd love to get started there. Um, so just talking about at the end, we were talking about our role in advocacy and how important that is um, as people interested in healthcare. We just wanted to ask about what role physicians and people in charge of health systems can play in addressing not just the outcomes, but also the structural causes of displacement and child vulnerability. And how do you navigate the gap between medical evidence and political will, like being able to urge policymakers to see what's happening?
That's a very sophisticated question. Nobody's got a good answer. And in many respects, people have to navigate that landscape for themselves. Um, Something that I've had to do my whole career, willingly. Uh, I wrote my thesis in college on U.S. counterinsurgency policy in Guatemala. So I was a political science security analyst before I went on to med school. And what I've done is combine these um, in ways that try to bridge the two disciplines. I'm also an analyst. I'm a technical person. I'm a professor, researcher at Stanford. So I strongly believe in evidence and generating a technical basis for collective action. Um, where it gets tricky is when witnessing publicly atrocities or trying to advocate for the protections um, can undermine your legitimacy as a scientist or as a humanitarian health worker. Um, Two of the most important humanitarian principles is independence and neutrality. Doctors Without Borders, those are biblical for them, those principles, because they have to be independent and neutral, or else the traditional teaching has been they become participants. The reality these days is that humanitarian healthcare workers who are basically neutral and independent are targeted. They're being targeted more than ever before. We see it in Gaza, we see it in Ukraine, we see it in Sudan, we saw it in Syria. Um, and so the protections that neutrality and independence have traditionally provided are not that effective anymore. And there's growing, I would say, groundswell in the humanitarian world to be more vocal as advocates because you're really not sacrificing much protection because you're not very well protected being neutral health workers anymore. That anybody providing health care is seen as a participant. because healthcare is a currency for legitimacy. And are, that currency is important, particularly in counterinsurgency kinds of conflicts. So, my view is that I remain a strong advocate and believe in my role to support the development of appropriate and just political will. But I'm also attentive to what my role is, what my voice is in this conversation, which is as a technical analyst, as a pediatrician, working for a federal court, as a pediatrician working in Ukraine or in Gaza. Um, and um, I'm comfortable with that role, even though at times it is complicated. Um, Being an advocate for migrant children these days is complicated, but it is the work that we have chosen, that I have chosen over the years. I think it's very possible to remain focused on developing technical innovation that addresses the needs of people struggling with the impact of war around the world. And I work closely with computer scientists, um, uh, working in Guatemala and Ukraine, with people working on technical solutions to overcome attacks on electric grids, on health infrastructure. Um, I have great hopes for the technologies that are emerging now to help overcome many of the traditional barriers that have impeded the provision of health services in these areas. So I'm very optimistic, very hopeful that um, that new technical advances will overcome things that have made it difficult for humanitarian workers to work in these areas for years.
And we are
Long
too.
answer, but
Yes. It's good to hear about your optimism because that's something that kind of we're trying to focus on here, that we do have the power and the ability to take on these problems. And so kind of just building off from that, we're just wondering, what problem do you think, like in this specific humanitarian health space, do you wish more students would take on? So what are the unique challenges of delivering pediatric care in conflict zones or refugee settings that you think that, I guess, like we have the ability to tackle through this challenge?
well, it is so diverse that it's hard to describe. Some of it I can't imagine, but you will imagine. I get it. Um, One is the direct delivery of services. Um, I saw Annalisa is going to be one of your speakers coming up. She's been working on telehealth solutions for Ukraine, uh, advanced communication capabilities, and AI to ensure that the best expertise is available to even the most remote areas. And that clearly is well on its way around the world to being very useful. But there are other arenas that I think are very helpful, particularly in prediction, um, using new types of technology to predict the kinds of problems that are likely to emerge uh, usually over a relatively short period of time, so that preparations can be made way in advance. And those predictive tools, I think, are um, likely to be very important, particularly imaging technologies combined with the dredging of social media and other things can put together strong predictive tools. Um, the other issue is witness, um, that what is happening in reality is always contested, like in Gaza, like in Ukraine. You get competing narratives, but there is a reality out there. And new technology can help define that reality in ways that argument can't. And I think that this is already becoming a very important tool for identifying the risk of famine. When does famine come? There are multiple ways to assess that, but increasingly, new technologies will be able to provide the kind of technical support that's going to be required. So I see it emerging in a lot of different domains. And to be frank, I expect to be totally surprised by some of the developments that are likely to happen even this year.
Awesome. I'll hop in with a question. Thanks so much for your presentation. I'm also glad to hear the optimism. It seems like a lot of the solutions will require some large ideological shift amongst populations, which seems overwhelming. I'm curious as to how you think about tailoring your care as a pediatrician to different populations. It seems like from your presentation that children in conflict zones share similar experiences, but regardless, their cultural background is so different, like Ukraine or Gaza or in South America. I'm curious as to how that's shaped your thoughts.
Well, a reliance on local capability is your best guarantee that it's going to be appropriate and culturally relevant.
Mhm.
We saw with the fight in West Africa, Ebola outbreak, that it took local leadership before we really saw a big impact of Ebola prevention and treatment take place. And that's always been my experience, that a reliance partnering with local communities is your best guarantee that you're going to be effective and that it's going to be sustained and durable and adaptive to things change real fast. And so our work in Guatemala is always reliant on local community health worker leadership. In Ukraine, it's the Ukrainians that are defining what's needed and what's not. The shift from evacuation to support for Ukrainian care was direct response to the Ukrainian guidance that said things have stabilized in terms of security and help us to provide the best care locally. Um, uh, Gaza is heavily dependent on intelligence and the remarkable strength of Gazan health workers right now, um, even though their capabilities continue to be um, diminished. But what's needed, what's not, how best to do things, the networks that I work with, um, are heavily reliant on the guidance we get there. Same on the border. So my strong suggestion is if you have participants from some of these communities, you listen carefully to what they are saying as you judge, because they may have insights into the reality that, you know, Stanford professor types like me just don't have.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I'm curious too as to how you think about the politicalness of this type of work. Do you see the two-party uh, problem of the U.S. as inhibiting the fact that this work becomes political? Like, is it better to address it from different countries or, you know?
Well, it's almost always political.
Mhm.
I mean, healthcare in the United States is political. Look at Medicaid, the fight of Medicaid, Medicare. Um, it's always political. So you really can't get around it. Um, some issues are more divisive politically or polarized or seemingly polarized. So I work with migrant kids, and immigration is definitely a very divisive political issue right now. Um, good. This is a country that's supposed to deal with strong political views. But what I have found is that even though that it's intensely political when you talk about immigration, I don't care if you're pro-immigrant, anti-immigrant, Democrat, Republican, conservative, progressive. When a child comes into the care of the people of the United States, we take care of them. And except for the certain people on the very extremes who want to use cruelty to children as a deterrent to immigration, almost everybody will say, yes, the line stops short of cruelty to children. Let's just take care of these kids. Let's figure out what to do about immigration. And people vote on that, and they voted for a president who said he was going to do something. Then they're going to have a chance to vote again if they like it or not. In the meantime, we look to what I would call the civil center to provide appropriate civil dialogue about these issues and a kind of humane American approach that still exists despite the rhetoric that flies around on social media or on TV.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much. I'll pass it back to Zainab.
Thank you so much, Kyle and Dr. Wise. We have one question from the audience. I think this is going back a couple minutes ago, but we have an attendee who was asking, how would you advise teams to address both the technical side of a product or service with the social, political, community aspect of the place you are delivering care? So how do you find ways to like work, I guess, like bridge between the technical and the political in delivering?
Yeah. Um, the simple answer is to involve people who you are intending to serve. They will tell you, usually, sometimes, sort of typical, an American come down with some brilliant idea, and they're going to, I won't say Stanford students, but it includes Stanford students at times, go to a certain place with a brilliant idea. They implement it, everybody has a party, it's great. A year later, nobody's using it. Or it had consequences that nobody really could expect. Your best guarantee is to involve from the beginning people who are going to understand the reality on the ground. And they're not going to necessarily understand all the technical aspects, but almost always they will understand its implications for them and their communities. And it's best to involve them from the start and to be open-minded. It's not trying to convince anybody that your technical strategy is brilliant. It's sharing it and listening to the feedback and working over time. It means an investment of time. It means an investment of ego. And something that I always try to convey to Stanford, not only Stanford, but other students that I speak to, usually at a commencement exercises, is be quiet and listen. Have some silence in your interaction with people around the world. And the benefit to you will be enormous. The benefit to your project will be extreme. And I have total confidence that there are wonderful technical strategies that will be developed to address many of the challenges that I presented. But I am also absolutely sure that in order to bring them to reality, it's going to have to involve people on the ground who would be the recipient, the beneficiaries, or the implementers of the technical strategies that are being developed.
Yes, thank you so much for explaining. That sounds, very on par with our interdisciplinary approach here. But just another quick thing that I wanted to cover was, in your opinion, when designing healthcare solutions for displaced or migrant children, what blind spots do you see students and innovators most often overlooking? Like, how do we ensure that our innovations don't overlook the actual needs of vulnerable children?
Well, it's difficult. It's difficult to sit in Palo Alto and figure out what's needed in Ukraine, Gaza, or Ciudad Juarez. That doesn't mean don't do it, obviously, but it means spend some time. You're not going to go to Gaza right now, but there are people who know the reality of Gaza. You can still talk to people off and on in Gaza, people who have left Gaza, people who have worked in places like Gaza. Involve them to give you the greatest insight, the best you can. Um, so, yeah, I think that there are ways these days, there are ways to engage um, the insights that you will require without having to go to these places. Um, and you're all very connected to people all over the world, especially this group. So I'm confident that you can do that. The biggest obstacle is a kind of I'll use this in a nice way, the arrogance of the technology, not necessarily of the people developing it. They may not be arrogant, but there's a kind of arrogance of the technology being imposed on communities without a real understanding of what the technology could do or the harm it could bring. I know I sound like a broken record, but um, I just see too much take place in the world that does not involve local communities or people who know those local communities well. And it's easy these days to do it. And I'm confident that all the people that will be participating in your program will have the ability to do it.
We hope so too. We have another question actually from Richa, a member of our team. She wanted to ask what you've noticed about the differences in solutions geared towards pediatric versus adult populations. So, would a solution, do you think, have to be built for either, or would it be possible to build a solution kind of like based on pediatric issues and then scale it up to the larger population?
Good question. There are many things that children need that are shared by their parents and their grandparents. Um, but the epidemiology of childhood is different than the epidemiology of the elderly. And coming up with solutions for adults almost always tilts to the older people because they have more illness, may be different than what it is for children, particularly young children. The other issue is a very pragmatic one, and that is there's almost always a lot of money to be made in providing health care to adults, particularly the elderly. Not so much for kids. Welcome to the United States. Kids' health policies are almost always shoehorned into policies that are built for adults. Why? Because that's where all the money is. That's where federal funding goes. That's where private industry makes money. That's where employers lose money. It's not on little kids. And so kids, not to be too facetious, become orphans in the healthcare innovation world. And I think it's great to look for shared interests, but also recognize that the epidemiology of need between different population groups are going to differ.
Thank you so much for explaining that. We do see that, sometimes there is a need to kind of like develop solutions focused on a certain population, but in trying to look for maybe investors and kind of to garner money, I think that it also does make sense to make solutions that are flexible so that you're able to gain investment for like a larger group of people. Um, and so I think just like a final question that I had was what kinds of solutions have you maybe personally seen or heard about, specifically maybe in the AI, the tech field, that have been seen to like advance the health of children in conflict-ridden regions?
Well, one is communication, the tele
Hmm.
medicine arena, using AI for decision support for lay health workers who don't have the availability of having a pediatrician on call at any given time. Um, I'm participating in uh, uh, colleagues in the University of Wisconsin, um, basically as a cheerleader for them, using new technologies for decision support for hypertension and diabetes management in adults, for community health workers. So protocols are developed, but new lab values, symptoms are fed into the system in ways that will create management recommendations based on well-known protocols, but tailored to the individual needs that the community health worker is seeing before them. There will be lots of that kind of work, I see. But I think the predictive and the witnessing capabilities will also be very powerful. Procurement, supply chain is a huge issue. And I believe new technologies will create much greater efficiencies and effectiveness of supply chains into complicated areas and the logistics in ways that are not sexy for a pediatrician, but make all the difference when you're trying to treat people who have been injured in a conflict. And then there's going to be mental health support, both for individuals, but also for local workers that will bridge continents, generations in ways that it's hard to predict. But I'm confident that I can already see it happening in Ukraine. Um, People around the world providing support. Um, I think we're just at the beginning. Your program is really just at the beginning of a period of enormous growth and innovation, and it's exciting to see young people like you all addressing these kinds of issues with that kind of potential.
I see that we have just a little bit more time. So maybe I think we can end with a personal question. You mentioned before that you started off more in like the public policy sphere. So I just wonder, like, what first drew you to the intersection of pediatrics and humanitarian medicine? Like, was there like a spark moment for you? What drew you to where you are now?
I'm not sure there was a spark moment. There was a spark for years, maybe. Um, I I left college. I was a shark fanatic, marine biology major, and then wound up in Guatemala for a summer because I wanted to see the real world. And went back, changed my major to Latin American studies, political science, and then left school. And in those days, a long time ago, we did have telephones and color televisions, but um, it was unusual to leave undergraduate. Now it's more common. But I left school, lived in Guatemala doing land distribution in the midst of a civil war. Um, so I learned very quickly about the realities of conflict and political instability, um, and felt that medicine provided some really important, good skills. Um, and I always like kids, I felt they were the most vulnerable. in many ways. And so went to med school, public health school, did residency in pediatrics. My first job was chief of emergency services at Boston Children's Hospital. So his background in emergency peds, but always combining the policy, the political with the technical. And been doing it first at Harvard. I was Paul Farmer's vice chief at Harvard before I came to Stanford. And I've enjoyed being at Stanford and its strength in multidisciplinary engagement. So it feels very welcoming to be here and to work with students like you.
That is incredible. We're so happy to have had you today and hear from like your, I guess, incredible background and all the expertise that you've had. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us, and we're really excited to have had you. Everyone, please join us for our next September Learning Series session on Thursday, and we'll see you then. Thank you, everyone. Have a
Thank
great
you all.
Thanks so much.